Some see it as a radical way to end boom and bust. Others describe it as a dangerous experiment. Just a few of the opposing views on the sovereign money proposal. It's being voted on in Switzerland on June the 10th, and the world is watching. Why? Because if a yes vote goes through, then Swiss banks would be the first anywhere to try out this type of system. So, what is this idea? Well, when banks lend you money, they don't physically take it out of their own coffers. They create it by putting the digits on your bank balance. Now, if the Sovereign Money Initiative gets a yes vote this weekend, it would mean that the Swiss National Bank would have to create all this money, either electronically or physically. And this would mean that banks could only lend what they actually have, among other things. Now, for those, it says, would reduce the risk of a 2008-style financial collapse. For those against the idea, well, they say it would hamper economic growth and the central bank would be politicised. Now, this Tuesday, S&P Global Ratings said that while it did not expect a yes vote to succeed, if that did happen, it could, quote, affect the creditworthiness of Swiss banks. Well, let's debate now why everyone is watching Switzerland with tonight's guests. Brian Blackstone from the Wall Street Journal, you're the Switzerland Bureau Chief, and John Revill, Senior Correspondent in Zurich for Thomson Reuters. Welcome, both of you. John Revill, if I can start with you. Why is the international media so interested in this vote? We have a lot of them, but never so that we've seen such interest. Well,
like what you've already previously said, this is like an experiment. It's never been tried anywhere in the world before. Other countries have talked about it, Iceland, Germany, but it's never actually got this close to actually being implemented before. And that's all down to sort of, say, Swiss direct democracy. In other countries, you have a parliament or elected people who will discuss it, and usually it's not got as far as that. But in Switzerland, if you get 100,000 signatures, you can have a vote on anything. And that's what's happening in this case.
And do you think, are we only really talking about this because we got the 100,000 signatures?
I think it is a new thing that's never been tried anywhere else before. So a lot of the world is looking at Switzerland and looking at the arguments backwards and forwards for and against it, and also how it could affect the country. So it's not the fact there's going to be a vote, but also the arguments that have been deployed on both sides.
Brian Blackstone, what's your kind of impression of how everyone's watching Switzerland and what we're doing here or trying to do here?
Well, I think what it's doing is it's a reminder that people are still really interested in the root causes of the financial crisis 10 years ago, and that those scars kind of remain. And so these questions of how is money created, how is credit granted to the private sector, is still something that people are really interested in. And what the referendum does is it kind of takes this from the ivory tower of economics, where people might talk about it in conferences, and actually puts it to a vote. There's a campaign. You've got people on the streets passing out brochures about it. You've got the people who are against it, the central bank making strong arguments against it. So what this is really doing is it's making it a politically relevant argument, as opposed to just something that every now and then an economist might come and make a persuasive argument for or against. This is really putting it in a way that people can understand.
Can people understand it, though? I mean, the people that you're talking to in Switzerland, do they understand what this is all about? Because it is a very tricky thing to get your head around.
Well, it's the kind of thing where the more you lift up the hood and look at the engine, it does get more and more complicated. And it's one of these financial market plumbing issues where and this is one of the arguments that the people in favor of the Volksgeld initiative make, which is people already assume that the government and the central bank creates most of the money in the economy. And so it is a challenge to get people to understand how credit is created and to write about how credit is created. But what this is doing is it's showing that these do have real stakes for the economy in terms of how money is lended, how it's borrowed, the kind of control that central banks have over the economy, which is still a really big issue, not just in Switzerland, but everywhere.
And John Revill, I mean, this idea that people are getting to grips with how the financial system works, is that why it's so interesting to an international audience?
I think it's partly to do with that, but also it's the effects that it will have on Switzerland as a financial centre. I mean, there's a juxtaposition that Switzerland traditionally is a famous country for banking, and now it's actually voting where it could completely change how the banks work. So it's kind of a juxtaposition there, like people think everything's hunky-dory and everything's working wonderfully, but there's a significant number of people out there who are not very happy with how it works. So it's not just how it works there.
Yeah, and I mean, that very point suggests that, people are not happy with the global financial system and the way it does currently work.
Correct. I mean, like what Brian just said, it shows that the scars of the financial crisis are still there. People in Switzerland are very concerned about the power of the banks, particularly after UBS was bailed out by the government in 2008. And although the economy here is doing very well, a lot of people didn't really know how credit was created in the past, and now they've learned. They're really quite unhappy, and they felt quite powerless in the past. But now, because of Switzerland with direct democracy, they do actually have some kind of power to influence how banks will work in the future.
Would you agree?
Yeah, it's really kind of showing that there is this interest, even 10 years after Lehman Brothers, even 5 years or 6 years after the onset of the Euro debt crisis, that people haven't really come to grips with how the next financial crisis might be prevented. And there's a buildup of bubble after bubble after bubble, and this is kind of aimed at that.
We touched on it a little bit earlier, but I want to bring up this whole idea about why here in Switzerland. I mean, Switzerland is known as being a safe haven, isn't it? I mean, do we still have that reputation?
I think so. It's it's a very stable, conservative country, which is why the currency is so strong here, which is one of the reasons why the Swiss National Bank has gone through extraordinary efforts to actually weaken the currency. I think, if anything, it elevates the importance of the debate because people tend to take Switzerland a little bit more seriously because of this reputation. So if this debate, if this vote is happening here, I think it elevates the whole issue a little bit because people say Switzerland has such a reputation for safety and security that these things tend to get a little bit more attention here.
But on the other hand, then why even have this discussion if Switzerland is so well and good? I mean, there are other economies that could be addressing this, not Switzerland.
But that's not for the Swiss voters. That's not of interest to Swiss voters.
Exactly.
They don't really care about what's happening in other countries. It's what's happening in their centre. And sort of 10 years after the financial crisis, a lot of people are still unhappy about, say, the power of the banks, and also the fact we've still got this very low interest rate environment where savers appear to be being punished, and the pension funds are having trouble because of low interest rates, and the residues is still ongoing. So although Switzerland wasn't directly hit as badly as some countries, there's still quite a lot of resentment out there. And also ignorance in the past, like that people didn't know how credit was created. So at the very least, even if the initiative does not go through, people will have actually learned quite a lot more.
I feel like that's the number one thing that is really kind of coming out of this discussion, that, people don't understand how the system works.
Well, people are understanding, reporters are understanding. To tell you the truth, I learned a lot just writing my stories about this. You cover financial markets, central banks, you kind of take things for granted. There's money supply, there's what central banks do with interest rates. And it's, if nothing else, this is a very worthwhile education effort because even if in the end people are opposed to it, it's worthwhile knowing how money is created and what kind of risks it generates.
And I was also saying it's a very serious issue by looking at the amount of interest that the SNB, which normally doesn't get involved in these kind of debates, is. I mean, they've been going full pelt for the last sort of 2 months at every opportunity, talking this down. So they're extremely worried about the outcome. I mean, the polls at the moment aren't looking positive for it, but then taking no chances.
I mean, and if it did get the go-ahead, I mean, the overhaul, to the Swiss banking system is almost, uncomprehendable. I mean, it's huge what would have to change. I mean, for it being quite a simple idea, actually create the money that we are using, to implement that is enormous.
It's extremely complicated, and the proposals, I mean, one of the criticisms I've heard is also that they're very vague in technical detail. And if it was put through, the government actually legally has 3 years to put it through and come up with some measures. So it wouldn't happen overnight. But then there's some question, would they actually introduce it how the initiants want it? Because we've just had the immigration vote a few years ago, and the government has been criticised for actually watering down the proposals since. So even if it was voted for, the initiants may not get the actual measures that they want.
And just to the point about the Swiss National Bank, the interesting context here is in the last 10 years, central banks have become so powerful. And here's an actual case where a central bank's saying, we don't want this power. It's too much for us.
Well, I find the whole political, or the fact that this is, economics and politics really kind of getting together, and yes, the SNB are, really don't want to go down that. I mean, how dangerous would it be for, a central bank to have this kind of political burden?
Well, they've been adamant that they don't want it because it would kind of reduce their leeway and it would politicise them in the future. But I would argue that central banks in the last few years have been political. I mean, monetary policy, the clue is in the word, but also interest rate setting is political. But then this would be a whole new kettle of fish, because then the central bank would have to create money and hand it out. And that's something they clearly don't want to do.
And central banks do differ. I mean, the SNB compared to the ECB, I mean, they are accountable to no one, and the Fed as well. I mean, how does this threaten the SNB in the future?
Well, I think it threatens them in a practical way, just overburdens them. Do they have the resources to decide whether I should get a mortgage or John should get a car loan? Now, I think that's kind of extreme. It might not go to that level, but still deciding the amount of credit that should be in the economy rather than steering these things through interest rates, which is what central banks want to do, is just something that there's a big doubt as to whether or not the SNB would just have the resources to be able to make these kinds of judgments. It's not their expertise.
And they actually want to steer clear of criticism, because in the past they've had a lot of trouble when they've abandoned the franc cap and they've not intervened enough in the markets. So although they are independent, they are acutely aware of public pressure. So they don't want to go out there and raise their profile any more than they have to.
We kind of touched on the complexities of all of this idea, this money sovereignty idea. Are there any countries who are watching Switzerland right now that would be kind of thinking, yeah, we need a solution to our financial system? Are people actually watching it to potentially find a solution?
Iceland and Germany have looked at it, but how close they are to actually implementing it is a whole new ballgame. There's quite a lot of scepticism in the broader world about the whole plan. I mean, the idea's been around since about the 1930s, I think. So I think people will watch and see how it works. I'm somewhat doubtful there'll be a rush to follow Switzerland immediately, because there'll be at least a 3-year gap as it's implemented. It's not going to happen overnight. And one of the great problems that have been highlighted by the opponents is uncertainty. So I don't think anybody else is going to rush in where Switzerland's gone first.
And of course, opinion polls are saying that it's unlikely to go any further than Sunday. But I mean, the financial industry is going to be too scared to take any kind of major leap like this, given the last 10 years.
Yeah, it kind of goes back to an earlier point John made. One of the criticisms, I think, of the Swiss referendum system is that it turned Switzerland into this kind of quirky experiment place where people can look in a serious way, look out of curiosity. Well, what's the percentage going to be? What would happen if it actually passed? When Switzerland has to live with the results of it. And so it can, in a good way, turn Switzerland into a laboratory for interesting economic ideas. But there are opponents who think that this takes the referendum system too far, where you have people from outside of Switzerland that are interested in this topic who don't have to live here if it's a bad idea and it passes. And that's, I think that kind of adds to the mix in all of this as well, given kind of the intense interest from outside of Switzerland in this.
There's a counterpoint to that. I'd say that Switzerland has a lot of referendums, but only actually 1 in 10 actually passes. So these are more kind of about raising the issues than actually implementing it.
Well,
it's a kind of staging pose, perhaps for something further down the track. But these things don't usually happen. I mean, Switzerland's a very cautious, steady, consensual country, where it comes back to what Brian said earlier. It's all about stability and being a safe haven. So I think a lot of the voters on Sunday are not going to go crazy. I think it's not. I don't think it's going to pass because people are concerned. They don't want to risk the stability, which has been the bedrock of Switzerland's success in recent years.
But undoubtedly, this has opened the debate or reopened the ongoing debate for economists, how to avoid another financial crisis.
Sure.
What about future developments? Where could this go then?
Well, I think that one aspect of this is with the whole push towards digital currencies, towards cryptocurrencies, that could breathe some new life into this kind of idea if it doesn't pass on Sunday. But if the margin isn't too heavily weighted against the sovereign money supporters. We've been talking a lot about the past and how the financial crisis has still kind of left scars. But there is this uncertainty now with all of these digital currencies coming up. An idea like this might gain more traction if people start to say, well, there should be a digital franc, an e-franc. And this sovereign money idea actually makes more sense in the context of digital currencies. So no matter what happens Sunday, I don't think we've heard the last of this issue. I think it can come back.
And so a kind of e-currency, a digital currency that's held by a central bank. I mean, it's almost like we're coming to it, this sovereign money idea, from just a completely new angle. And is that more acceptable to people, perhaps?
Well, I think it's a reflection of how long it takes these referendums to come around. The genesis of this is the financial crisis, but it takes several years to get the idea, to propose changes to the Constitution, to get the 100,000 signatures, and then it's a lengthy process to actually get a referendum date. So in a sense, the people who are supporting this idea, it's not as relevant for the past, but it might be relevant for a situation that maybe they hadn't envisioned 5 or 6 years ago.
And I'd also suggest, in addition to the digital currency point, some parts of the sovereign money initiative could be broken off and implemented separately. I mean, one of the proposals is people could have sovereign money accounts which are guaranteed with the SNB, which are going to pay no interest at all, and maybe banks in the future could offer those. Then maybe not going to do the whole thing where the SNB would absolutely have to create all the money for the Swiss economy, but they could offer sovereign money accounts to people, and some people who are particularly risk-averse may go for those.
So a kind of halfway house, if you will. Do you think there was much interest from people that you've spoken to?
There'll be some interest in that. I mean, at the moment, in your current account, you get almost no interest anyway. So why not go for like officially no interest and being 100% safe?
So I get the impression that this idea is not going to disappear, but I also am kind of very interested in the fact that we're only talking about this because 100,000 people in Switzerland said, yeah, actually, let's talk about it. It's not very many people to bring up a debate that could be so globally, impactful.
And I think that's one of the criticisms is 20 years ago, it was probably difficult to get 100,000 signatures. Now with social media, it's easier to organize these kinds of things. And so it's a balance because it's obviously a system that Switzerland thinks works for it, and they take it very seriously. You don't have shocking results, as John was saying before, but the threshold for getting an idea onto a referendum is a lot easier than it was 10 years ago.
And John Revill, would you agree with that?
I'd agree with that 100%. I mean, I would say occasionally there are surprise results every so often. I mean, we've had the Minder vote on controlling executive pay. We had the Masseneinwanderung immigration vote. So these do occur from time to time. But I think the Swiss system works. I think people are informed about it. It's not a hysterical debate. One of my colleagues gave me his little booklet. You get a little booklet from the government, argue with points for and against each time. So it's very civilised. So if nothing else, people have always at least learned something.
OK, John Revill, Blackstone, thank you both very much indeed for joining us for tonight's debate.
Thank you.